Leora Anderson wiped down the kitchen counter for the third time that morning. The house was eerily quiet, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards. Her son Soren had left for school hours ago, and Darren, her husband, was long gone for work. Most days passed like this, in a quiet routine she had become accustomed to, yet today something felt off. It had all begun innocently enough. Kian Morgan, Soren's science teacher, was young, attractive, and charming. At first, Leora had barely noticed him. But as time passed, their interactions grew longer, more personal. What started as casual small talk at school events evolved into stolen glances, and soon enough, they were exchanging text messages late into the night. The affair that followed was as thrilling as it was reckless. Kian made her feel alive again, something Darren hadn't done in years. She wasn't just a housewife with endless routines and schedules anymore. She was desired, exciting, and in control. The secrecy added to the thrill, but lately the thrill had started to wear off, replaced by an undercurrent of fear. As Leora absent-mindedly polished the countertop, her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced down at it, her heart skipping a beat when she saw Kian's name flash across the screen.
We need to talk, now.
Her stomach twisted. Kian wasn't the type to send panicked messages. He was always so careful, so composed. Why the sudden urgency? Without thinking, Leora grabbed her jacket and slipped out of the house, barely remembering to lock the door behind her. She drove through the quiet streets of Redcliffe, her mind racing. What if someone had found out? What if Darren knew? When she arrived at the park, their usual meeting spot, Kian was pacing nervously near a bench. His calm demeanor was gone, replaced by tension and fear. As soon as he saw her, he walked quickly toward her, glancing around as if making sure no one was watching. Kian, Leora said, her voice barely above a whisper, "What's going on?" Kian rubbed his forehead, clearly agitated. "Leora, I think Darren knows about us." Leora felt the air leave her lungs. "What? How could he possibly know?" "I saw him last night," Kian replied, his voice shaky. "Outside my house." He was sitting in his truck, watching. Leora's blood ran cold. Darren was not the type to notice things easily. He was too wrapped up in his work, too caught up in his routine to pay much attention to anything else. But if Kian was telling the truth, if Darren had been watching, then everything was about to unravel. "Are you sure it was him?" Leora asked, her voice trembling slightly. Kian nodded, his eyes filled with panic. "I'm sure." He didn't say anything, just sat there. "But he knows, Leora. I can feel it." Leora's mind raced. If Darren knew, it was only a matter of time before their lives fell apart. She could lose everything, her family, her home, her life. She grabbed Kian's arm, desperate to keep control of the situation. "I'll talk to him," she said, trying to calm her racing heart. "Maybe he doesn't know for sure. Maybe he's just suspicious." Kian didn't look convinced. "We need to be careful, Leora. I don't think this is just suspicion. I think he's planning something." For the rest of the day, Leora couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled deep in her chest. When she returned home, Darren was already there, sitting in his usual spot on the couch, watching TV. He didn't look up when she walked in, didn't even acknowledge her, but Leora could feel the tension in the air, heavy and suffocating. "How was work?" she asked, trying to sound casual, though her voice wavered slightly. Darren barely glanced in her direction. "Same as usual." Leora studied him carefully, searching for any sign that he might know about the affair. But Darren was hard to read. He had always been the type to keep his emotions bottled up, to hide whatever he was feeling behind a mask of indifference. She wasn't sure if that was a blessing or a curse. "I ran into Soren's teacher today," she said after a long pause, testing the waters. "Kian Morgan." For the first time, Darren turned his head slightly, his eyes flicking toward her. "Oh." Leora's heart raced. "Yeah, he mentioned something strange. He thought he saw you near his house last night. Were you out late?" Darren turned fully toward her, his face expressionless. "Why would I be near his house?" Leora swallowed, trying to stay calm. "I don't know. Maybe it wasn't you. He just seemed concerned." Darren's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than usual before he turned back to the TV. "People get concerned about all sorts of things. Leora's blood ran cold. Was that a hint? A warning? Or was Darren just being his usual aloof self? She couldn't tell, and the uncertainty gnawed at her for the rest of the evening. Over the next few days, Leora tried to avoid Kian. She couldn't risk raising Darren's suspicions any further, but the tension in the house only seemed to grow with each passing day. Darren became more distant, more detached, and Leora couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her, waiting for her to slip up. One night, everything changed. It was just after midnight, and Leora was lying in bed staring at the ceiling. Darren was beside her, snoring softly, but she couldn't sleep. Her mind was too preoccupied with thoughts of Kian, of Darren, of what would happen if the truth came out. That's when she heard a faint noise from downstairs. Leora froze, straining to listen. It came again, a soft scraping sound, like someone trying to force open the front door. Her heart pounded in her chest as she sat up slowly, trying not to wake Darren. She grabbed her phone from the nightstand and crept out of bed, moving quietly toward the stairs. As she reached the bottom step, she saw the front door was slightly ajar. Someone had been inside the house. Leora's hands shook as she quickly dialed the police, whispering into the phone as she backed away from the door. Her mind raced. Who could it have been? Was it Darren? Or someone else? The police arrived within minutes, sweeping the house and yard, but they found nothing. No sign of forced entry, no trace of the intruder. Darren woke up groggy and confused, insisting he hadn't heard anything. Leora wasn't sure whether to believe him or not. The next morning, Leora received a message from Kian, "Meet me at the park. It's important." Her heart sank. She didn't want to go. She didn't want to face whatever was happening, but she knew she had no choice. When she arrived at the park, Kian was already there, pacing nervously near the bench. "There was someone in my house last night," he said, his voice low and strained. Leora's blood ran cold. "What? Who was it?" Kian shook his head. "I don't know. They didn't take anything. But they left this." He handed her a crumpled piece of paper. Scrawled across it in jagged handwriting was a single word: "Stop." Leora's heart raced. "What does this mean? Do you think Darren?" Before she could finish, a car screeched to a halt nearby. Leora's stomach dropped when she saw Darren step out, his face twisted with fury. "You think I wouldn't find out?" Darren shouted as he stormed toward them, his voice low and dangerous. "You think I wouldn't figure out what's been going on?" Leora felt a wave of panic wash over her. She tried to step in front of Kian, to shield him, but Darren's anger was palpable, radiating off him like heat. "Darren, please," Leora said, her voice shaking. "This doesn't have to happen." Darren's eyes were cold, his hand reaching into his jacket. In a flash, he pulled out a gun, the metal gleaming in the dim light of the park. "Kian, get out of here," Leora whispered, but Kian didn't move. His eyes were locked on Darren, fear etched into his features. "You betrayed me," Darren growled, his voice thick with anger. "Both of you." Leora's heart stopped. She could see it in his eyes. Darren wasn't going to let this go. In a split second, the gun went off. The sound echoed through the park, loud and deafening. Kian staggered back, clutching his chest before collapsing onto the ground. Leora screamed, rushing to Kian's side, her hands shaking as she tried to stop the bleeding. Blood seeped through her fingers as Kian's eyes fluttered closed, his breath shallow and erratic. She cried out for help, but the park was deserted, the quiet night mocking her desperation. Darren stood motionless, the gun still hanging loosely in his hand. His rage seemed to have dissipated, replaced by a look of shock. He stared down at Kian's body, as if he couldn't quite believe what he had done. The weight of his actions slowly began to sink in, and his shoulders sagged. "Darren," Leora whispered, her voice barely audible. "What have you done?" Darren looked up at her, his face pale, eyes wide with a mix of guilt and regret. He dropped the gun, the metallic clatter echoing in the still air. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he muttered, his voice distant. I just couldn't take it anymore." The sound of sirens broke through the silence, growing louder as they approached the park. Someone must have heard the gunshot and called the police. Darren didn't move as the flashing red and blue lights illuminated the scene. Leora knelt beside Kian's lifeless body, numb with shock. As the officers swarmed the area, the police arrested Darren without resistance. He didn't say a word as they cuffed him, his eyes glazed over, lost in his own thoughts. They led him away, the gun still lying on the ground where he had dropped it. Leora sat on the cold grass beside Kian, her hands stained with his blood. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions: grief, guilt, fear. Everything had spiraled out of control so quickly, and now there was no going back. The affair that had once felt exciting and liberating had ended in tragedy, leaving nothing but destruction in its wake. In the following days, Redcliffe was abuzz with the news of the murder. The small town, usually so quiet and uneventful, was now the center of a scandal that no one could have predicted. Leora withdrew from the world, barely able to face the reality of what had happened. She had lost everything: her lover, her husband, her sense of safety, and there was no way to undo the damage. The trial came quickly, and Darren was sentenced to prison for Kian's murder. He didn't fight the charges, didn't try to defend himself. It was as if he had accepted his fate the moment he pulled the trigger. Leora attended the trial, though she barely recognized the man standing before the judge. The Darren she knew had been consumed by anger, jealousy, and betrayal, and what remained was only a hollow shell of the man she had once loved. As for Leora, she was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. The town judged her, whispered behind her back, but none of that mattered anymore. The guilt weighed heavily on her, and she knew that no matter what, she would never escape the consequences of her choices. In the end, the affair had turned deadly, leaving nothing but ruin in its wake. Leora had thought she could have it all: excitement, passion, a life outside her mundane existence. But the cost had been too high, and now she was left with nothing but regret and the haunting memory of the life she had destroyed.